Okay. One lifetime, one voice, one moment for existence's show. Hello, everyone. Welcome to tonight's episode. Why would one person speak about the suggestion that there could be future potentials to how language is moving in people's minds? Why is it important to consider a civilization's direction? We find that individually people seek some sort of purpose. That means 8 billion beings, human beings on this planet, and for most of them, they're following some sort of story of meaning. From an evolutionary perspective, language is a simulation of matter. The child that is born adopts the language. As it adopts the language, it has for the first time found a way for the free will to animate the world. As the free will constantly drives the attention to various frames of reality, various ways that subjective value is extracted from objective phenomena. Our existential intelligence moved through matter. It then moved through the creation of matter. And the creation of matter can be said to be the extension of thought, so similar to how human beings extended a sort of individual consciousness, or an individual extension, an extension of an individual consciousness of this collective intelligence that is this world, that is this existential moment. Sorry guys, just a second. I'm Pretty much the title is referring to how language is moving in people's minds. Language comes to be a product of attention. Attention is, in some sense, an awareness. This awareness compartmentalizes itself. Your subjective reality is divided into various senses of self. Your objective reality is one singular, particular dimension. When you kind of wonder about the purpose of matter, you see existential phenomena. Its purpose is innate, it's in it. That means when it's like when you design a chair, the purpose of the chair is in the design. So similarly, when human beings wonder about the meaning of their objective life, what is the point of this objectivity? Why are the eyes open? Why is the world here? You see, existentially, existence is to exist. What greater purpose can there be? It is simply design set free in the abyss of space. But when we look at the purpose of the mind finds shelter in stories. The mind contains itself in stories. Language is, I've said it before, language is the skin of the ego. But another way of saying it is language is the clothing of your sense of self. It is what your mind wears when you're alone with all that is. The linguistic simulation, pretty much how language is in the awakened mind, or finds itself functioning in the awakened mind. Any person using a sort of linguistic intelligence, you can close your eyes and the words will still be there. But in regards to objective reality, when you close your eyes, objective reality goes away. So you see, the value of the subjective realm is that it has a sort of presence that remains even when the sensory is inactive. So many of us think that our bodies were, in some sense, came first, and then our minds kind of sprouted out of this the sophistication of the brain. However, Mr. Within considers that I find it's the other way around, because there's been moments where I've had dreams, and in that dream state, I was conscious. I could move, I could go left, I could go right, I could move in the dream, pretty much. I had a dream, and then I woke up from the dream and I was shocked. I was shocked because the sense of free will engaged. That means it was as if when the body was inactive, the mind was still being a body of some sorts to itself. So the mind had a sort of, appeared to me, a sort of simulation in which the material reality finds value in, you know? This simulation seems to be prior to the objectivity, which will completely reshape, if there's a truth to this, if there's a truth that there are dimensions before our eyes have opened, to the dimensions that we see now. In some sense, the knowledge based on the singular dimension suddenly breaks in the recognition and the exploration of other dimensions. So pretty much, imagine human beings in one part of the world, they think they're the only human beings. Eventually they go to another part of the world and they acknowledge the natives. And suddenly the world has, in some sense, opened its eyes to itself in a different way. human intelligence has to do, let's say there's two human beings. We see the example of two human beings. And we want to wonder which has the greatest human intelligence. And we will say the greatest human intelligence is an awareness to how intelligence arises in the human being. In one human being, we see the person is considering their intelligence based on the definitions of the human being given to it. And in the other, we see the human being is defining itself. It is defining itself out of its own experiences. And when the directness of experience gets forgotten by a civilization, that's when tyranny becomes very excessive. Tyranny becomes excessive because people are consumed, their attention is being devoured by ideology. But by not all ideology, you see, this world, when you look at history, you realize that normality doesn't exist. You realize that morality is a sort of illusion of decision making. What was correct thousands of years ago to us now is incorrect. And what is correct now, thousands of years from now, will be incorrect. And so we are just voices in some sense on a stage of manifest forces, manifest phenomena. It's very fascinating. This world is too fascinating to stay quiet about. I'll share the truth. When I was younger, I was incredibly shy. That means the way I functioned in society was that in some sense, I did not care to be visible, and at the same time, I did not care to be invisible. So, in some sense, my experience, my youth, is a sort of attention roaming wherever this world took me. Eventually, after some point, after going over 20 laps around the sun, I eventually came to some profound conclusions. I came into conclusions that in some sense time is ticking. That means even though Plato says time is a moving image of eternity, it is unavoidable that the physical position is going to in some sense decompose, or in some sense the material kept in this way is going to in some sense leave. You can say the biological existence based on its genetical design is a sort of ceremony of cells. You see, sometimes I have looked at my own physical body and I'm like, why are these particles here right now? Why are the elemental forces preserving the nature of man, the design of man? Why is the planet at a certain axis? Why is it not so close to the sun that we're all roasted and not so far that we're frozen? So the world eventually will shock you. That shock is in some sense the evocation of excitement and novelty. And pretty much when a kingdom gets destroyed, what tends to happen next is that other kingdoms are formed. And right now, I consider my existence to be a sort of kind of like in ancient traditions, they acknowledged the states of existence as stations. Especially in Sufi dervish culture, reality was set into stations. And what that means is there was the station of individual consciousness, and then there was the station of collective consciousness. And the station of collective consciousness, at least to the fathomable aspect of the mind of the being, like how far the human being could fathom that state, would be in some sense a sort of hollowness that is preserving what is fulfilling. So eventually, life at first, you are in a very Think of it this way: all relationship with phenomena originates from simple values. As the simplicity duplicates and there's conscious retention, suddenly there comes a greater structure. Think of it this way. Think of it this way, that because you have a memory, every thought that you get is a particle, and that these particles eventually, once they get together, they gain a sort of molecular identity. So the person in the present moment is being sculpted by their memory and imagination. Yet their memory and imagination, outside of the linguistic simulation, outside of the story of time and space, will be seen to be a momentary generation. So human beings, because our ordered reality is based on stories, anytime we move beyond the linguistic simulation, there will be a wave of chaos that will hit this person. When I say chaos, this chaos doesn't mean destruction. Sometimes creating the thing at the wrong times, creating something at the wrong time could be chaotic. To a world who has been living in lies for centuries, suddenly telling it the truth will be chaotic. I find that there was a movie that captured the human condition, I find personally, in an incredible way. And it was just this one movie scene from Lord of the Rings 3, where it's the battle by that kind of castle connected to the mountain, where this king by the name of Theoden, like of the Men of Rohan, he's there, and he suddenly, like, they defeat the first wave of enemies, and then they suddenly look behind them and they see these ridiculously giant mammoths walking towards them. And so, as a king, all he can do in that moment is he suddenly tells his men to regroup and they charge. And what that means is, when there is an inevitable force facing you, when you recognize, regardless of what kind of people you have met in this life, whether they have been good or bad, all of them will have moments where they will look out the window and wonder what will happen. And that wondering what will happen is actually the confrontation of the chaos in regards to the past order. The thing is, because we have, in some sense, simulated time into a linear kind of movement, it's as if we took change. Time is a concept extracted out of change. When you understand how much life is changing, you can never blame anyone. You can never. It's as if, like, Heraclitus has this quote where he says it's the same. He says, "No man can step in the same river twice, and it is not the same man, and it is not the same river." And what he means by that is that, if you were a religious person hearing that ancient Greek philosopher's quote, you'd probably think, okay, so what does that mean? Every time I pray, I'm a new self praying to a new moment? And so that is the magnificence of reality. This is why, whether we like it or not, we are artists by nature. We are creative beings by nature, because there is a design here that engages with the designs that are already here. When you understand your eyes have opened in a world, when you realize civilization was the effort of all of our ancestors for us to be here, and now that we are here, it's as if the people of 2019, they are forgetting. They are forgetting that the values of the ancient world created great momentum towards future progress. In this life, intelligence can fundamentally be chosen by you to function in a certain way. A decision is a solidification of the inner reality into the outer. And so what it means is that, ladies and gentlemen, there is love and loss here. There will be moments where you will be walking among your civilization, where you will not be ashamed of your species' progress, where you will see that the values lie in people's hearts if they beat long enough. We are 8 billion and growing minds. We're not just, it's not an overpopulation of just physical bodies. All these physical bodies have, in some sense, non-physical properties. They have immaterial visions. We are a part of nature. We are like an objective part of nature that can move itself in accordance to subjectivity. And we don't know what thought is. That's the confusion. That's why philosophers, I'm sure there were some modern like the educational system, it's a brutal place because it's the control of the attention of the civilization. What you teach a civilization is what the civilization will know. And so it's not about just what a child is taught, it's about the sequencing of ideas that approach the child. And this, in the Buddhist way, there's some parts of it are uncontrollable. You cannot choose, even if you're a parent, you cannot control your child's eyes and your child's attention. You know, their curiosity for the world, their wonders, their personality that takes shape. But you can control the environment the child finds himself in. And so there's been moments where physically I have in some sense made mistakes, whether it was to hurt myself or others, whether it was to quarrel in petty arguments. There have been moments where I have felt I was unauthorized by the world to continue. And that statement may sound odd, but how it felt in that moment was there came a moment where I felt, as an intelligent phenomenon on this planet, there was no value. And that's kind of one of the dark nights of the soul, where the self breaks. You see, it's very unique. They say an egg, if the egg breaks from the inside, there's life. But if the egg breaks from the outside, there is no life. And so if an external circumstance changes your inner circumstance, you know, you will feel suddenly there's no life, as if the chaos has overpowered the order, as if the human being doesn't deserve to be here because it has made too many mistakes. However, if the inner reality changes the outer, that is when hope fills the world, for your eyes are open. It's as if the being is like, I have lived to see my beginning. I have been born. What shall deny my death? You see, it's as if, imagine an extraterrestrial species came and said, you guys could be eternal forever. We'll give you this, like, I don't know, flower to kind of smell, and like that you'll be eternal. We'd look at that extraterrestrial civilization and we'll be like, get out of here. We'll be like, we don't need to play games of immortality when the mind is eternal from the beginning. Alexander the Great, he was a great conqueror. He had conquered many things. And so one thing he realized that was left to be conquered that he had not was mortality. He realized time will conquer him. He realized there's no greater conqueror than time. And so Alexander the Great sets out this mission And he tells all his subordinates and all his men, in some sense, to look for the elixir of life, to look for the fountain of youth. And so one day, one of Alexander's men comes to him and says, Alexander. And he's like, what up? And he's like, Alexander, we found it, man. We found it. We found the fountain of youth. And Alexander's like, no way. You guys are all getting promotions. And eventually they take Alexander the Great to this, they tell him that there's this kind of wall, like this cliff, and he has to climb this cliff, like towards this cliff, and suddenly in this kind of like vertical wall of a mountain, there's a cave. So it's only a person alone by himself can go. And so Alexander tells his men to stand guard, and he in some sense climbs the mountain, and he's he's of course a conqueror. He's a very strong individual. And what Alexander the Great does is, in some sense, he gets there. He gets to the kind of cave on the cliff. And he goes in that cave and he sees there's a fountain with a water so clear that he has never seen before. It's as if it's the real deal. It's the fountain of youth. And because he's climbed, he's so thirsty and he's about to drink it. And right when he's about to drink from the water, he suddenly hears a voice. And the voice is like, don't do it. And so Alexander the Great looks around and he doesn't find anything. He doesn't see anything. And so he goes to drink again. He thinks he's hallucinating or something. And then suddenly, right before he drinks again, suddenly hears the voice. And the voice now more urgently is saying, don't do it, don't do it. And Alexander the Great is like, is that my conscience? Like, where's that voice coming from? And eventually he sees it's a crow. There's a crow there by the fountain. And so Alexander the Great looks at this talking crow and he's like, yo, crow. And the crow's like, what up? The crow tells Alexander, don't drink from the fountain. Alexander's like, why not? The crow says, because I drank from it and I gained immortality, but I became a crow. I became an immortal crow. And Alexander the Great's like, holy shit, okay, I'm not that thirsty. And he leaves, you know. Imagine the story, suddenly like 50 Cent the rapper kind of uses a time machine, teleports there, and gives Alexander the Great a Gatorade, you know, best commercial ever. Anyways, Alexander the Great climbs down. And so the moral of that story is that one, immortality may seem the ultimatum of a desire, of temporary desire, but you will eventually think of yourself as if right now this body didn't die. It was always the same. Okay? You would see the world pass. You would see that you have unnaturally preserved yourself, but nature naturally passes. You will eventually feel left out from your world in a strange way, you know? So for me, trust me, the fear of death is a perversion, you know? The worship of life too much is a perversion. It all has to do with an acknowledgement of the presence of nature and how the presence of nature is being what the being is feeling they are. And the presence of nature doesn't mean suddenly the person just like goes into the woods and is like, I love nature, I'm gonna hug a bear right now or a tiger. Like it's not an illusion. It's not, you should stop looking for heaven if you actually want to help the world. Because as long as you're looking for heaven, your mind has a conditional basis. That's why it is so easy for people in society nowadays to be cruel, to not care, because they are in pursuit of their own heaven, and if they feel an action doesn't, or something doesn't lead them towards their own heaven, they will in some sense wreak hell, you know. And so you can say the first sign of a person in some sense moving towards inefficiency, heaven and hell, for me, of course, guys, I don't have imagery for them. For me, it's like one is the ideal, the archetype of efficiency, the other is the archetype of inefficiency. However, because heaven and hell they arise from a narrative. You know, a lot of what is held as knowledge is actually stories that have lived through people's attentions till now. So if everybody in some sense is simulating the reality, if everybody has different beliefs, these beliefs can be written down. You know, if somebody believes there is God, somebody believes there isn't God, because it can be written down, it means it's still linguistic. When a person finds a belief that is not linguistic, it can be, it's either indirectly subjective or directly objective. And the relationship of these, ooh, that's the fascinating part. For me, like these Mr. Within talks, they're kind of like a challenge of the night for me. Because the challenge is that I understand even though there's few people, like maybe 1-2 people listen to when I talk. But for me, when I speak, my mind is in one world. And in some sense, when I wonder about the nature of the future, how decisions now will move forward, you know what I see? I constantly see structures being built and then structures being demolished, and then new structures being built and structures being demolished. And so I have come to realize that thoughts and language and conception, it is like a city behind my eyes that I am walking in, you know? It all has to do with the principal universal philosophy. Similar to how the world has a certain axis, you as a human being, based on your unique stream of experiences and who you have been so far in this life, your values for reality are on some axis. Now, this axis tends for most people to go into their subconscious because the demands of an objective survival require a sort of competitive efficiency. So the person finds himself in competition with the world around them. So you can't be honest all the time, because then you're that naive fool being used, you know. So then how would the civilization grow in the actuality? And so this is why there's this notion that certain values must be preserved regardless if the person likes them or not. They are like the pillars of civilization. Right now, it's as if the foundation has been laid out. Language has been developed, you know. The sophistication of our technologies and our, in some sense, libraries it's very fascinating. It's as if all of history is the process of the inner reality of man to communicate to the outer. And what is in history books is what the inner reality was inspired to preserve. And so you will eventually come to a moment where I say you will find a sort of universal independence. For most people, it is too chaotic. It is as if it is too unfathomable to just be alone in a universe. It is as if chaos, okay? But there's different types of loneliness. There's different sorts of solitude. And what I mean by that, there is an unconditional sort of loneliness and there's a conditional loneliness. When you become aware of conditional loneliness, usually brings with it misery. It's because you have not behaved in accordance to a certain condition. So in some sense, you have fallen behind of the herd, or maybe even moved ahead of the herd. Either way, there's a sort of solitude in your eyes. It's like what you see is only real to what you see. Henry David Thoreau, this American, I consider him an enlightened poet. He says, "It's not what you're looking at that matters; it's what you see." And so what 8 billion people see is going to be the vision of the civilization. We don't have a common ethos. And so just to explain to you, explain a bit about the subtitle of this. When we wonder about how language is being the world and moving in people's minds, how language is moving the world in people's minds, we will eventually realize the communication of language, the movement of words from one awareness to another domain of awareness. Pretty much, we cannot ignore the tribal dynamic of the civilization, and hence the civilization communicates to one another. To the members of the civilization communicate to one another. And so because this occurs, there arises an ethos. An ethos is like the purpose written in the program of the context of a community. It is the inspiration of, you can say, groups of people. In 2011, I had an experience which I felt it kind of set into motion my greater self inquiry. And in the year 2011, I considered my character to be the opposite of who I am now. I did not care about even to consider other dimensions. And I was trying to fit into a world that only my mind could expect it like that. And eventually, the problems in my life, and especially my arrogant display, my lack of awareness to what I was, I felt caged, and I felt in some sense unauthorized. I felt my karma was kind of holding me back. Whatever, it's like, as if, think of it this way, as if uh, this comedian had this story where he was intoxicated and he goes to a pizza place and there's a pizza and he constantly tries to grab it, but his fingers suddenly, it's like they're hitting a force field and his fingers are getting destroyed. And the next day he goes and sees there was a plastic casing. He, like, because he was intoxicated, he didn't realize, like, he had to open. So his hand were in some sense kind of like, as if, imagine hitting glass or like plastic, transparent plastic. So the notion is that I felt the way the karma of my moment was something similar, where I was trapped in a glass room. My desires were kind of urging me to go live in a certain way, yet at the same time I felt I could not even fulfill my own desires. So think of it this way: it was a sort of inner subjective sense of failure of self to self. You see, there's ways that you fail in front of others, and there's ways that you fail in front of yourself. And that's usually a lot of anger and hostility arises when a person cannot stand failing in front of themselves. And what that means is it has to do with honor, and it has to do with a sense of realizing that any sort of failure or inefficiency, it's just data. There's like stories, we create their beginnings and ends, you know. So the ego is in some sense a character in a video game, and the video game's program is language. That's what I'm telling you. What the memory will be found to be is just a classification. It's a classification of time. Without time, you'll suddenly find your memory is kind of floating in empty space. In 2011, there was this place, I was living in Toronto, Canada, and I went to this park called Edwards Gardens, and there was this stream, like more than a stream, like you could say something like a slow river. And so I remember I sat on a rock, it was a sunny day, I sat on this rock, and I looked ahead, and in front of me it's as if the river was coming from behind me, so when I looked at the river, everything was moving forward. And I remember sitting on that rock and wondering a question that had never occurred to me, and when it occurred, like in that moment, it was kind of very transforming. I remember I sat there and I'm like, okay, I've lived like till 2011, and I felt as if like, man, I have so many problems and nothing's going forward. And suddenly on that rock, I asked myself, who's looking through my eyes? What is this sight? What is this intelligence within my eyes that is just looking out and seeing the world? And I realized I didn't know. And whenever you are in some sense brave enough to see what you don't know, you will only see beyond what you know. It's like the edge of knowledge is the exploration of new territory. You see, you have to look at the design of the biology, and you will get a sense of certain subconscious considerations. Your attention. What if I told you it cannot be owned by a thought? It cannot be owned by a name. I can choose any name right now. I could choose to make any sound uh, as a living being. But the momentary generation does not define the whole intelligence. And this is why it's as if rather than us thinking everything is so clear that we can decide objectivity is the only reality, we're starting to see to see what's okay. It's as if the life has brought with itself certain there are certain illusory inhibitions in our perception, certain blockades, you can say, and these blockades arise. So for me, it's kind of like the world is too big to put into a story. Similarly, it's too big to measure. And what in some sense changes is like the universe doesn't care. It's like, the natural world doesn't care for a person in the same way that a person cares for another person. Okay? You can say a person could be lonely and could expect like they're having one of those days where they need a hug or something. And so the person's alone sitting, and suddenly a bird comes, and in their mind they're like, oh nature, how about you? And so suddenly the person expects the bird that's like kind of beside them to kind of be playful or something, but suddenly the bird flies away too. The bird's like, okay man, you two in your own thoughts for me to be a bird around you. And so what I'm trying to say is that when you wonder about the nature of phenomena, by how the observer, which is being your intelligence right now, as the awareness of the whole moment functions, There are certain, it's as if like this waking state is one state. You see? When in deep sleep, nobody has problems. Isn't it strange? Many human beings fear death, but we don't fear sleep. You see? In certain cultures and certain contexts, it was acknowledged that life was just something you're awake and then you sleep. You know? This is why they said it's like the graveyard is a resting ground. It's as if in some sense, the beings, the forces that were animate as that phenomena, in some sense, find their conclusion. And pretty much philosophers are kind of left in two positions. Mr. Within, right now, I'm going to tell you what I feel personally for the next like 50 years is going to be the most profound kind of debates. It's going to be whether man is God's imagination or God is man's imagination. And eventually the conclusion will be unknown. We cannot define world peace by just saying we all agree with one another. Because if we all agreed with one another, we would have no uniqueness. Do you know, we would be a world of clones. We don't want a peace, a utopia filled with clones. You know, filled with people just listening to one way things should be. It's a changing world. The utopic our understanding of what a utopia is must change. Our comprehension of how we find this civilization to advance, well, obviously it has to do with the ideas that are exposed to people. The child is, again, not just spoon-fed baby food. It's spoon-fed various ideologies by its environment. You listening to this talk is one of those things, even, because that's the nature of the world. When you're in the jungle, when you're in the forest, you have to have an alertness. You shouldn't just walk there with I mean, there are sages who have such divine reverence for nature that in some sense nature can never hurt them because nature is them. You see, what you are, you don't worry about. You only worry about what you will become or what you are not yet. Have you noticed this? Right now, you listening to this, you, let's say, have no problem with who you are. You know, you're comfortable being this. You see, what you're not comfortable having, like in some sense, with how fast you're getting to where your mind expects. So when the child is younger, because it starts off from it starts in a condition of dependence, eventually its ideals of that which is beyond it will be in some sense the opposite side of the spectrum. So an independent sort of unconditional state. This independent unconditional state has been the fascination of many human beings because they have gotten bored of reality. When you get bored of reality, that means it's as if you've caught into a loop. You have seen the edges of certain programs of function. This is why maturity is not based on knowledge. Only the humble will learn. Only the humble will hear the master's true words. Imagine there was I'll tell you this fascinating thing. I went and saw this. Here, I'll share a story with you. It's a big story, so I'm going to say it quick. Swami Shivananda had a disciple named Swami Vishnunanda. Swami Vishnunanda is telling this story. I saw this video on YouTube. The story is very inspiring in some ways. So the story is, the story is about when Swami Vishnunanda was a disciple and was just like a kid in his 20s who had joined the temple. And so one night he comes and sees, he gets this eerie feeling, this eerie intuitive feeling, as if something, like some alarming feeling. He's like indoors and he suddenly gets this alarming feeling and he runs outside. He runs outside and he suddenly just follows that intuitive eeriness and eventually comes and sees that Swami Shivananda, kind of like the head of the temple in some sense, this very liberated being is sitting in meditation, and there's this kind of psychopath with an axe trying to hit Swami Shivananda's head with the axe. But the axe constantly comes to his head and suddenly moves to the left or moves to the right. It's as if the axe doesn't want to hit Swami Shivananda's head, but the psychopath wants to hit Swami Shivananda. Something like that. And so suddenly this kid's Swami, kind of guy in his 20s, it's like being a disciple of Swami Shivananda, somebody who the temple very, very much cared about, suddenly runs and tackles like that psychopath, and that guy falls to the ground, and suddenly the police are called, other disciples wake up, and Swami Shivananda is just like, he stands up his meditation and watch. And the police come and the disciple explains what happened, and in some sense the police take the man to, in some sense, the station, to the police station. The next morning, Swami Shivananda, like, it becomes morning time, and Swami Vishnunanda and all the other kind of disciples are all like in the morning, and they're like, holy shit, some guy tried to kill this like kind of compassionate being. And they suddenly see Swami Shivananda's woken up and he's walking, and the disciples are just super quiet. It's as if there's this awkward atmosphere, but Swami Shivananda's attention is not to that. And Swami Shivananda goes, and suddenly they see him getting this giant plate, this giant tray, and filling it up with the best parts of the fruit and everything like that. And Swami Shivananda takes the fruit, and people think like this. I was like, okay, maybe he wants to go eat outside or something. And suddenly they see Swami Shivananda walking. He's walking towards the police station. And so eventually the disciples follow, and after some time he gets to the police station. And the disciples are just in some silence, kind of following and seeing what happens. And they suddenly see Swami Shivananda walk into the police station, and the people at the police station know who he is. And so they respect him and they let him through. And it's this very strange moment where the disciples, the police guards, the inmates are all looking at what Swami Shivananda is doing next. And Swami Shivananda tells the police to open the kind of cell of that person who tried to kill him the night before with an axe. And he puts the tray of food in front of him, and he suddenly bows. Swami Shivananda bows to this guy. And Swami Shivananda, by the way, guys, he's like 6 foot or something. He was a big guy. And so they see this kind of person bow to the person who was killing him. And it's a very emotional moment, very intense. When I heard the story, I could feel the emotional intensity echo. But like being there in that moment must have been something else. And so Swami Shivananda does this. And later on it is revealed that Swami Shivananda, the reason he did that was because he realized that that guy with an axe was not a guy in an axe. It was how the universal intelligence was conducting itself in that moment. He realized, in some sense, the will of the divine in the most undivine act. And so that was the sort of humility the sage had, where it's as if once you truly see the collective field of intelligence, you will not keep your ego. You will realize, holy shit, what am I doing? Dressing up through one sort of ideology my whole life. What is this? So this new cultural ethos that I feel it's going to extend in the next, 50 to 100 years, what I feel is primarily going to happen is that human beings will have to find new stories, and they're going to start creating new stories. And what that means is that like what how the person acknowledged themselves now, let's say it falls into a sort of kind of context. Okay, so this context will change as new concepts arise. Eventually a new spirit, a new ethos will arise where it has to do with a sort of collective community. It means an equal moment. Every moment of existence is allowed to exist. Do you see? That is in some sense the first notion of freedom, as if the first roar of freedom was in some sense, you are allowed to be here. The second roar of freedom was in some sense that your minds can look as far as they want into this world. And the third roar of freedom was that you are free even from yourself. Because this was the complex thing. This was something about Vedanta, Vedic cultures and mysticism and the whole concept of enlightenment, where I was like, what the... Like, it was one of those early things that I was like, how's that possible? It's paradoxical. It's as if the person, they say they want to see themselves beyond material reality. Okay, and the ancient kind of approach to existential self-inquiry was that matter was an illusion. And pretty much nowadays the same approach can be said is slowly being reached by anybody who entertains a sort of simulation theory to the world and whatnot. So this is what didn't make sense to me, because the person wants to be free from the materialistic universe, but the identity that wants to be free from the materialistic universe is based on the materialistic universe. So I'm like, how can matter be free of itself? It's an impossible task. And then later on, I realized it doesn't have to do with matter. It's like everything anybody has ever said to you about enlightenment, it's just a preview. Let me tell you why. Because it's your reunion with a natural rhythm. Seldom this is said. Truth is not, the ultimate truth is not in words. The ultimate truth is in some sense a dynamic, living, experiential rhythm. You tap into it. You abide by it. Your alertness catches it, and your attention embraces it based on that. So most people think, okay, I want to be independent, so they want to let go of what they're dependent on. They don't recognize that the independence that the person should seek, it's as if, again, from the child's viewpoint, that's dependent on the environment. I mean, we're kind of raised that way. You know what I mean? We are raised being dependent on, for example, the nourishment that we get from our environment, the sort of resources, the shelter, the food and water we get from our environment, the social company we get from our environment. The child is dependent on these. But once the child eventually sees the true face of life and sees that it has a shadow, there's like the goodness of the world, the kind of playful states of bliss. And then there are the chaotically intense kind of states where the person has been thrown into an animalistic loop. It's this animalistic instinctual loop. It's kind of like something like muscle memory, but more genetical, you know. Sun Tzu was a master of war in some sense. He's the guy who's authored The Art of War. And The Art of War is a very interesting book. I think most people read it for the wrong reasons. But The Art of War is, if you look at it, it's as if a person can fight with their body. Okay, you can physically fight. And then there's the mind's ability. And the mind's reach is much further than the body. The body, like I can reach on the table and get this cup. Like my mind can't suddenly make this cup levitate into my hand. Okay, my body has to move towards it. Okay, but my mind can see this object, can suddenly name this object, can classify this object, can see its utility in accordance to various displays of reality. What goes on behind our eyes is the magnificence of what in front of our eyes leads to. A statement where I am kind of proud of the moment I said it. It was like I was so happy. I was so happy because I suddenly, it was like this kind of like problem that I think for a while, maybe not just one lifetime, was bothering me. Suddenly it was like I found a way to communicate it. Because the inner reality has a sort of infinite quality. So your memories right now, you think they end at the edge. Let me tell you what's behind your earliest memory of this life. If you want to retain it consciously, it will be your imagination. If you don't want to acknowledge your mind, your imagination can become a sort of world in a world which takes your attention away. So for me, I don't have an obsession with thoughts. For me, thoughts, they have a natural value. There was a time where the way I would think, I'm talking about now the faculty, the ability of the mind in some sense. And I would think about life through words, through language. But then the way I spoke was different as well. I would speak in accordance to structures of language that I had accepted. But later on, when I became more aware of the subtler planes, of my subtler planes, and everybody has subtler planes of abstraction and imagination, that's how I term it, by the way. Because the word plane is very important, because my whole methodology towards existential self-inquiry is to, in some sense, evolve from the eyes of the advanced communicator to the pilot of consciousness. So your free will has a value, and most people don't know the value of their free will. Their value of their self is really based on others. That means that I've seen people in environments, literally their character is because it's trying to fit into the environment, it's being molded by the environment. It's savage. It's kind of seeing the environment program the kid's head, you know? And when the environment programs the kid's head, the kid suddenly feels it is conceived. It's as if the evolution of its belief led it towards that sort of ideology. This is why contentment with change is the greatest kind of sign of existential maturity. No longer how existence moves shocks you that much. And where will words lead? How will our minds open our eyes next? How will the next moments define us? The mind of the child expects, because it's dependent again, it has an expectation. So I consider my lifetime till 2011, when I had that unique experience, when I wondered what's within me, what's looking out my eyes right now. When that became important to me, it changed my whole way I approached existence. because it was no longer a dependency on the external. The internal kind of principles of being became necessary to wonder about. And I was going to share a quote from Sun Tzu. Sun Tzu says, oh my God, this is a new quote, guys. It came to me, but he says, ultimate excellence lies not in winning every battle, but in defeating the enemy without ever fighting. And to be honest, guys, the same thing you got to do for any sort of enlightenment mindset you have. You have to get rid of the problem. Either you're waiting for the world to get rid of it for you, or you have to get rid of it. Either you have to change or the world has to change. And inevitably it will all change, but your free will is the opportunity. You see? In the long term, when we look at life in the long scale, our free will is like, it's not free. We're chained by the global structure of things. We are chained by the forces and the laws of nature. You know, if we had true free will, we could all just fly in the sky. You know, gravity would not be a condition. Physical reality would have an unconditional sort of approach to the human being. But because it has a conditional approach, we define ourselves based on our environment. But that is still, as modern gamers would say, to define yourself by the environment is like, it's like what a noob does. And where's the world heading? I find that the economical system is fighting for the attention of the consumer. And the consumer is fighting for their status. And their status is how their attention has valued life. Life is as beautiful as it is not. If there was all beauty all the time, you would never know its beauty. If there was never beauty, you'd still never know what beauty is. But because beauty comes and goes, because we are individuals and then we are a field and then we're an individual, we're oscillating. We are creatures that are, in some sense, by nature rhythmic, you know? 4 billion years. And still we are very far from the answers of our truth. Humanity's extinction, I consider it's inevitable. But I consider that it's as if the actor is allowed to perform on stage and the show is going on, and what kind of show must be displayed. Trust me, it's only questions that inspire me to give these talks. Because you can never share an answer in a changing world and feel satisfied. Do you know, it was a very chaotic moment for me when I was contemplating, in some sense, the nature of a collective movement. What that means is I saw birds flying together in the sky. I saw fish under the ocean kind of swimming together. You know, even wolves run together. You know, lions have their pride. And so man's mind through communication is the closest thing that gets to that, you know? And I've wondered what would this collective entity look like if the efficiency of 8 billion people found a performance here. The mystical approach has kind of advised that let go of the world before it lets go of you. In some sense, the Sufi dervishes from 700 years ago, they entertained a mindset where it was mystical, in a mystical context, and the meaning was to die before you die. And what that means is it's a sort of ideological death. You know, in a certain way of looking at this picture of existence, you can say the child is born twice. It is born as, in some sense, physically, its objective reality comes into position, and then its subjective reality comes into position. Its objective reality is a sort of collective condition. Its subjective reality is a sort of individual kind of freedom. So you can say the conditional state gives birth to the unconditional state. And the unconditional state, in order to define itself, must accept conditions, therefore brings a new condition. It's as if a child of a lineage of like tyrants suddenly opens his eyes and he's like, why such violence? There are questions that can break the answers a person has before. And there are questions that can give answers to problems before. And the will of man must be studied. And our approach to studying it is not good as a civilization. We don't care for our minds. We forget to understand it is attention. Attention is your free will. And if your attention is controlled, oh my God, you have in some sense been sold into ideological enslavement. In a changing world, what belief can stand the test of time? You tell me. It is all fun and games, for even the belief, if relayed, is not the same belief. Two mindsets arise. How free are we if we were never free? And how free are we if we were always free? If I entertain only an objective notion that we're just physical beings, then in some sense I have to accept the idea that atoms can love one another. And when I think of an atom, I don't see a personality to the atom to love. Therefore, the objective reality is a level. It's a way of acknowledging life. It doesn't have to encapsulate everything. Similarly, with the subjective significance of reality. So the child expects the world to listen to its mind to already. It's like the world the person sees, they assume that the whole world is like that. Okay? Because they assume the whole world is like that, and subconsciously they have to, or they wouldn't be a self. So you have to, your sense of self is in accordance to the world you see. And the world you see just instantly translates into a sort of subjective linguistic simulation. So this is the thing, that morality has a lot of subjective factors. And because there is this subjective element to morality, we have to design it. It's as if no mistake was a mistake when the solution came. So thanks for tuning in, guys. I find that Your life is as valuable as your world is. And if you don't care for the world, know that you don't care for your life. But if there is something in this world that you care about, something other than yourself that you feel is worth watching to continue, then you will suddenly feel it's a, how can I tell you, it's like my intuition, people's conscience, like the way it is said to the mainstream, it's like a voice, like don't do that, like kind of voice. But for me, my intuition has been a sort of command. It has been the natural world roaring in my ear. And so in those moments, it's like when your intuition comes as a command, it's very fascinating because reality moves into an instantaneity where you're not defined by the past of your ideology or your awareness. Your awareness suddenly finds itself unconditionally free. When your awareness finds itself unconditionally free, it's a sort of state called Satchitananda. It means conscious existence is bliss, which means when you recognize existence and consciousness are the simultaneity of how the moment is here, and even though man tries to contemplate it and words try to separate the reality, yet the imagination will find itself short. Your imagination will bow to the truth of your being. And when it bows to the truth of your being, then it will suddenly see that once the eyes of ignorance were closed, the eyes of clarity opened. For change is here first. Change is here first. You acknowledge that, you will find peace. The futures of the linguistic simulation will lead the educational systems around the world to an apocalypse. All those people who feel they are at the peak of knowledge will suddenly feel their ivory tower is collapsing. And they will suddenly recognize that knowledge should not be defined based on what is known. It should be defined by what is unknown. Imagine the educational system, its whole grading mechanism, the way it was designed wasn't to just make the person a good soldier for the economy. The educational system was there to say, "Oh, children of the world, these are the unknown aspects, these are the parts of the forest unexplored, these are the parts of the world and parts of the mind and angles of looking at this universe that now is the time to look into." Children become inspired because they see their exploration and energetic attention and contribution in kind of stretching mankind's awareness is where the value is. What that means is for the first time humanity needs an army where its weapon is not a gun. Its weapon is the vision to see what it would look like if the greatness of the civilization was found. Because if we let nature to manage the free will, nature will decide for us anyways. So in some sense, our ability is kind of like risk management in some sense when it comes to life, when it comes to living it. You have to risk this. And so what that means is like it's as if the actor thinking that he has to go take improv classes. It's as if hilarious. Every moment is improvised. Every moment the attention is working based on a totally different brain chemistry. It's as if like, how can we say who the actor is when every moment is a sort of simulation of attention? And so, what is the value of the depth of the ocean? Rabindranath Tagore says you cannot cross the sea by merely staring at it. And to be honest, it's too big to have a leader. So, in some sense, nature has evolved these creatures. These creatures have then evolved, and in some sense, their free will has come into position in the design of what they could create. So, you can say the free will of the human being can be measured based on what the human being has created. And the lack of the free will is based on what the world has created. And so it's as if the free will of the human being was created by nature. It's as if human beings are nature's magic trick. Rumi says, out beyond ideas of right doing and out beyond ideas of wrongdoing, there is a place. I will meet you there. Attain your ultimate excellence through the clarity of your present moment. What if the illusion is the truth and the truth is the illusion? What if heaven must be built on earth? What if paradise must be built? What if it's not a location, rather a state of mind? What if attention is the god of thought? Where your attention goes, the your world moves towards and is derived from. Some say the poet speaks too much. But the poet says, when the world is bleeding, all you can do is shout. The greatest expressions on this planet have been fueled out of an anti-desire. They have seen the mistakes of the past, and so the future is now, how would I say it? It's like the future generations, they're gonna like if they hear my talk, they're gonna be like, wow, look at how the world used to be. Because it changes so much. Be free before you could not be. Be playful with the changing world, and you will be its secret. Much blessings in the Namaste.